what concerns me is that a lot of the discussion around this issue seems to be targeting ordinary, harmless practices going on in churches. You will routinely see people refer to conversion therapy as including corrective rape and prayer. Now, they put those two things in the same sentence. That's routine, as if these are in the same spectrum. You read activists from the Banned Conversion Therapy campaign saying things like spiritual guidance is really just religious speak for conversion therapy. Some people say church is offering pastoral care or sitting down and talking and preaching to people about their lifestyle doesn't constitute conversion therapy, but I'm sorry, it does. You've even got people specifically calling for gentle, non-coercive prayer to be caught by the ban. That can't be right. I don't think most people would think that that's fair, and it would also not be human rights compliant. There are Article 9 rights, of course, and this committee we're very conscious of that, but there are Article 9 rights, not just to hold religious beliefs, but to manifest them. There are rights for Christian organisations and churches as organisations to hold and manifest their rights to order their own affairs. And there are Article 8 rights for families, the Article 8 right to privacy, and so therefore the right for, within limits, for parents to bring up their children as they see fit. These are important rights which have to be kept in the mix. I think it is possible to devise a conversion therapy ban which is human rights compliant, which does tackle genuine abuse, and which doesn't get used to undermine the ordinary work of churches. But I think it's going to be difficult.
We've had some evidence to suggest that conversion practices could even have positive outcomes. Do you have any evidence of that?
I think no one's going to benefit from being coerced or abused. And that's the threshold that the government is talking about for its law, and that's the right threshold. So whatever the context, whatever the motivation, if somebody's been coerced and abused, the government proposal is that coercive or controlling behaviour that causes serious alarm or distress and has a substantial adverse effect on the victim's usual day-to-day activities. That's the threshold. But again, to agree with Danny and to repeat myself, that obviously does not include people praying with their friends. That obviously does not include parents sensitively raising their children in the Christian faith. So again, those things are not conversion therapy. They are beneficial, but I'm not going to sit here and say, that there are beneficial forms of conversion therapy. The case that I'm putting to you is that the ordinary work of churches, harmless, gentle, non-coercive practices, they're beneficial. And we have to be very careful drawing up this law that, by accident or by design, we don't drag any of that into the firing line.
It sounds as if I could just explore this in a bit more detail. It sounds very much like there is a divergence here in terms of what you as panellists would define conversion therapy as, and what has been widely reported in media, for example, and by some campaigners. Perhaps if I can give Simon one scenario, and if perhaps you could help draw a distinction for me here. If I use the example of the Liverpool church that had an undercover journalist go in, and videos came out of that church of a lot of speaking in tongues, a lot of shouting, a lot of really aggressive language. That was defended by the leader of that church as prayer. Would you draw a distinction there between what you define as gentle, pastoral, normal activities of the church, which shouldn't fall into a definition of conversion therapy, and coercive behaviour as described within the government consultation, for example? Is that where a distinction would lie?
So certainly, you and I have both seen stuff on TV and heard accounts of stuff going on in churches that makes you wince. And that, what you're talking about there, that sort of shouting and so on, that doesn't reflect my personal theology. And you would want, you would want churches to, be more careful about what they do. But I would put this to you: the question is obviously going to be for parliamentarians. What exactly does Parliament want to make a criminal offence? Now, you mentioned speaking in tongues. Again, that's not my theology, but I'm sure you're not saying that people who believe they're speaking in tongues should be criminalised for speaking in tongues. I know you're not saying that, but I'm trying to draw lines here. So, again, people shouting their prayers, should that be a criminal offence to shout your prayers? I don't think most people would think that it should. Again, we come back to coercive and controlling behaviour, abusive behaviour. If you have a religiously neutral law, which with a clear and high threshold of the kind that we're talking about, dealing with coercive and controlling behaviour, then that can be applied in all sorts of contexts and can protect people, from genuine harm. But as I look at the examples that get sort of put into this discussion by some of the activists pressing for a ban, they say things like, my church was very gentle, and I asked my friends to pray with me, but I now think that's bad and that should be criminalised. That's not reasonable to say that it should be criminal to pray with somebody when they ask you to pray with them. You look at the case studies on the Ban Conversion Therapy Campaign website, and some of what they describe, a lot of what they describe is horrifying. But then you'll have these lines like somebody says it became clear that teaching that people must remain celibate unless they really felt that they were ready for heterosexual marriage. This person says that was harming people. Well, you can't. Nobody seriously, surely, wants a criminal law to stop churches teaching celibacy. And that's my concern, is that a lot of the rhetoric behind this would result in us bringing in one of the most religiously repressive laws that we've seen in this country for centuries. We can't do that. We've got to be focused on behaviour that deserves to be criminal, not a theologically motivated or a theologically targeted law.
Okay, I want to expand on this question of ask, because that's a big feature of the consultation, is this idea around consent. And again, we have a divergence, I think, between what campaigners are asking for and what is in the consultation. And again, Simon, if I could perhaps come to you first on this one. The government's proposals state that adults should be allowed to voluntarily engage in conversion therapy if they're given all relevant information about what a therapy or practice involves, as well as information about the known risks. Now, there's a lot of controversy here because, of course, there's a long-established principle that you cannot consent to harm, and then I think there's the argument of what constitutes harm. There's a lot to unpack there, but could you give me your view? Do you agree with this proposal within the consultation, or is it problematic?
I'll try and give a short answer to this, but it's very complex because, look, we are grateful that the consultation paper includes, several reassurances about the kind of things that I'm talking about, the everyday work of churches. But there's a huge lack of detail in the proposals, and there is confusion within the consultation paper itself. So the government says it's going to ban coercive and controlling behaviour that causes serious alarm or distress. We've said that has a substantial adverse effect. Secondly, it has to be motivated by conversion therapy. It's not terribly clear. That probably means an intention to change someone's sexual orientation or to change them to or from being transgender, but quite how you put that in criminal law, I've no idea. And then thirdly, that adults can consent to this, but that under 18s can't. Well, if the threshold really is a high and firm criminal law threshold of genuinely coercive, controlling, abusive behaviour, why would anybody want to consent to it? However, if the threshold is not high and clear, if they give us, if Parliament gives us a criminal law which is hazy and risks, vicars finding themselves in the dock, having to explain whether or not their prayers, were caught, then you do need a consent defence, because at the very least you need the vicar to be able to bring in the person who says, I asked him to pray, I consented to him praying for me. That's the only circumstance in which I can see consent being relevant, is if the core offence is too broad in the first place. Much better to get a focused core offence.
What is the difference between conventional prayer and prayer that could be considered to be conversion therapy? I know we've spoken about this already, but what is the difference?
So what we can't have, what we don't want, is a criminal law which goes to the theology of the prayer. It can't be a criminal law about whether you've prayed the right kind of prayer, theologically speaking. The fact that somebody prays and their prayer reflects the Christian sexual ethic, the one that's set out at the beginning, sex is for marriage, marriage is between a man and woman. That might not be a popular view, that might not be a fashionable view, but it is the mainstream Christian view, and it is a protective view. So if their prayer simply reflects that theology, you can't make it criminal, just for that reason. But if, for example, somebody is holding somebody down against their will, allegedly to pray for them, well, that's a breach of existing criminal law. If somebody is screaming abuse into somebody's face, that, again, can be caught by existing law and should be caught by existing law. If they're keeping somebody in a room against their will, again, these are things which, regardless of the motive, where it's taking place, they're already criminal, should be criminal, and the criminal law can be used in that situation.
Okay. So, what other than prayer then? What other religious practices are you concerned could be classed as conversion therapy and could be outlawed as a result of this legislation?
We took legal advice from Jason Koppel QC, and we put to him a series of specific scenarios, ordinary church practices, and what we asked him to do was, we said, take the wording of the Victoria conversion therapy ban, also the Canadian, state of Victoria in Australia, so that's on the statute book, comes into force February next year. We asked him to look at the draft wording in Canadian Bill C6, and we asked him to look at a definition advocated by the Ban Conversion Therapy campaign. And we asked him to firstly assess whether these ordinary scenarios would be caught by a ban in those terms, and secondly, whether that would be human rights compliant. And so the scenarios included things like evangelism, where somebody shares her faith with a friend at work, but this friend at work is interested but reacts angrily when she learns that all people everywhere must repent of sin, including sexual sins. We had an example to do with church membership, a church removing a man from membership for being persistently unfaithful to his wife, and the unfaithfulness involves homosexual activity. We asked him to look at baptism and confirmation classes where the teaching in the class includes Christian living and it includes teaching on sexual ethics. We asked him to look at churches' policies on who they will and will not administer communion to. And in the specific scenarios which are set out in his opinion, he said in each case, those ordinary church practices, harmless, everyday church practices, would be caught by the Victoria ban, would be caught by the Canada ban, would be caught by the ban conversion therapy wording. And, he said, in turn, in each case, that would be a breach of the human rights of Christians. So those are the kind of scenarios that we're concerned about.
I'm not sure somebody going up to somebody at work and denouncing them and telling them that they must free themselves from being who they are is everyday normal.
Well, let me talk that through. So somebody is sharing their faith with somebody at work. Look, I agree. This is the problem with this issue. We start by talking about homosexuality because that's the presenting issue here. It's not the way Christians start their conversations. It rarely comes up in churches. it's in the Bible, but it's not in every page of the Bible. But when it comes up, the churches have to teach what is in the Scripture. Anyway, so if somebody is sharing their faith and the person is asking them questions, well, what does this mean? Well, as Christians, we believe that all people are sinners. Everyone, 100% of the population are sinners in need of forgiveness. That's why Jesus Christ died on the cross. He died on the cross for sinners. So, okay, well, what do you mean by sin? Well, there's 1,001 things that you could mention, things that are, it's inconvenient for all of us because we all find ourselves in that list somewhere. But if the person, as in this scenario, if she's a lesbian, she asks the direct question, so the Christian doesn't raise it, her lesbian colleague, her friend at work, asks her the question, she has to be able to give a direct answer to that question.
Ask her what question?
Ask the question, do you mean homosexuality? Do you mean that homosexuality is a sin? If the Christian answers that question, straightforwardly, and then her colleague objects to that was a particular factual scenario that we put to them. People do object for all sorts of reasons. People object to hearing about aspects of the Christian faith, not just to do with sexuality, but people do object and they do get angry sometimes, and I understand that. But the question is, do you want to inject the criminal law into that situation?